Okay, so let's get started. So, the focus question for today is how are newly freed African Americans denied equality at the end of Reconstruction? At this point, you guys are familiar with the Compromise of 1877, which effectively ended Reconstruction. And we've kind of alluded to how this is where all the kind of bad things are going to start to occur for African Americans. Because prior to this, in the middle part and beginning part of Reconstruction, everything was okay. All right, so over the next couple of days, you're going to look at the Jim Crow laws, you're going to look at sharecropping, you're going to look at literacy tests, Plessy vs. Ferguson. It's a couple of different things that you're going to be looking at that have kind of altered life for African Americans throughout this time. The trajectory they were on was good, and now it's all going to go kind of bad. All right, and things are going to go move more downhill. All right, so first off, we're going to look at a couple of photos. Just use the chat box to kind of see what you think the photos kind of are, or just some things that you notice and wonder about the photos. I think they'll be rather familiar in terms of maybe some things you've seen previously throughout PS 89 or throughout your life, but let's just talk about these two things right here. Okay, so use the chat box. Anything that comes to mind, anything that comes up, you can just write down, please. What do you notice? What do you wonder about these two photos? What do you notice? What do you wonder? Okay, so this is segregation, okay, which we'll talk about a little bit. What about the specifics of the photos? Take the water fountain photo, for instance. What's so interesting? Tiara, I noticed that they. Okay. Quality difference between the sinks. Okay, good. Okay. So yes, you guys are looking at segregation. Now, I'm fairly certain these aren't sinks; these are water fountains. But this is such a bad water fountain; it kind of looks like a sink. But yeah, you see that there's two different water fountains for colored people and for white people. The Imperial Laundry, obviously, this is one of those situations where this company would only wash for white people. Yeah, they're water fountains. You can kind of tell more with this one, okay, than this one. But yeah, these are, what we call the start of segregation. Now, both of these particular situations, whether it's the water fountains being segregated or in this case the laundry company only washing their clothes for white people, is the start of what we know as segregation. Now, for this class, you're going to have to kind of know the term segregation and the Jim Crow laws interchangeably. And I'll kind of talk about what this means in a little bit. But you guys are going to copy this down. All right. Please copy this down here. I'll give you a minute to do so, and then we'll discuss the slide and we'll discuss what the Jim Crow laws were. Okay. So, what were the Jim Crow laws? So, basically, segregation doesn't just happen out of the blue. It doesn't just happen as a norm. I want to make this extremely clear, though, from the start. Segregation did not occur prior to the Civil War. Before the Civil War, you had slaves and you had free people. Okay, there was no really such thing as segregation. Segregation kind of gets started a little bit with the Black Codes in 1865, but really becomes very popular in the 1880s, 1890s, and then all the way until around 1965. Um, the way segregation occurs, is by laws. Okay, now the Jim Crow laws weren't like one specific law. Each city and each state and each town had their own Jim Crow laws. Okay. So when a Jim Crow law was passed, okay, or when a law was passed, it was given the name Jim Crow law because it led to segregation. All right. So these were laws passed to cancel or find loopholes to the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendments, and any other federal law that tried to help out the equal status of African Americans. So 13th Amendment ends slavery for African Americans. 14th Amendment gives them citizenship. These were laws that were loopholes around those amendments. Now, the amendments say that African Americans have to be free. Okay? They have to be free. However, the law does not necessarily say that they have to be doing it together or they have to be doing it with one another. All right? It's a crafty little loophole when you think about it. All right? So, what happens is from these Jim Crow laws, we get what's called natural segregation. So in the South, you had a lot more Jim Crow laws, so you had a lot more segregation. And depending on where you lived, whether it was in a city or a town or a state, you could have more Jim Crow laws than other places. In the North, were there Jim Crow laws? Yes, but not as bad. Okay, there'd be more basic stuff, maybe having a beach separated, okay, as opposed to an entire school. But the South had a lot more Jim Crow laws, and you can imagine this right after the Civil War. And now that the troops leave the South is going to start taking advantage of it. So, give you some examples of Jim Crow laws. One example is obviously dealing with you guys is schools. A lot of schools were segregated both in the North and the South. Okay, public places. Okay, we're segregated. A lot of beaches, a lot of parks. Okay, whites had to be in one area, blacks had to be in one area. All right, public transportation. Okay, we will learn about a lot in this class. Obviously, trains. Okay, and buses. Okay, there were certain cars, train cars that blacks could be in. They couldn't be in others. I think we saw that with Frederick Douglass briefly, but this had continued after the Civil War. Buses, obviously, white people in the front, black people in the back. Right? This would become a major issue with Rosa Parks about 50 years later. We'll learn this a little bit later on. Restrooms. Okay, so you guys go to PS 89, you're going to have a male bathroom and a female bathroom, but back then there would be a white male bathroom and a colored male bathroom, and then a white female bathroom and a colored female bathroom. So let's just quickly go over what this colored term means. Pretty much anyone who wasn't white would be under the colored, realm. So it wasn't just black people. You could have an Hispanic person. You could have Middle Eastern person. Even some dark-skinned Europeans, okay, can be kind of mistaken as a colored person and be expected to use some of those water fountains, okay, or restrooms or what have you. Okay. So drinking fountains, obviously, we talked about were segregated. And the craziest thing is the U.S. military was also segregated. We'll talk about this a lot when we get to World War I and especially World War II, how we fight in these crazy wars against these enemies, across the world. And our white and black people don't fight together. It's really kind of stupid when you think about it. Yet we're on the same country fighting for the same team. They won't fight in the same regiment, basically. They won't fight in the same group. Okay. Now, basically the whole idea was, okay, and we'll talk about this more with the next slide. Basically the whole idea was that these two things can be separated as long as they are equal. So it's okay to have segregation by law technically, as long as they were equal. Now, the big misconception is that segregation was a thing. How do I say this correctly? That segregation was a thing that only the white people wanted. That's not true. Plenty of black people were okay with being segregated and being separated from white people. Now, we're used to in 2020 for a lot of diversity and people being in the same room of different races and different colors. And obviously, just look at PS 89, there's a lot of different groups of people. A lot of black people and colored people were okay with being segregated. What they weren't okay with was the quality. Things were not clearly very equal, except I'm going to argue, I'll think like a Southern lawmaker, I'll think like a Southern Democrat right now. These are equal. Take a look at these water fountains. To me, those can be considered equal. Someone in the chat tell me how these two things are equal. How in the world could those two water fountains be equal? Anicia, they share the same pipe, kinda. Abigail, go ahead.
Is it because like they're both water fountains and they both like they give you water, but the difference is the quality of what they're getting?
Close. On the right track. Maheen, close. They have the same purpose. Close. You got the same water. Close. They both serve their purpose. Close. These are equal. Not equal in quality, but they are equal. Okay, here's how they're equal. There's one each. One for the colored people, one for the white people. So by law, it's very tough to prove something as not equal because quality is very subjective. Okay, you could have a piece of food that you may think is delicious and someone else may think is not good. Okay, so the quality of things is very, very subjective. Okay, but you can't deny that there is one water fountain for each, so it is equal in terms of numbers. Okay, now, we know that's not what segregation was all about, equal in numbers, but by law, segregation can be considered legal because there's one each. Okay, so the Jim Crow laws were passed all throughout the South and became a very big thing throughout American history. Okay, I know we saw Brain Pop yesterday. We got one more Brain Pop today, but this is going to more focus in on Jim Crow. It's 8 minutes long. We're just going to watch the first 4 minutes because it's going to go into some of the details of Jim Crow and how it became what it is. All right, so I'll get this started in a second here.
Uh-oh, looks like traffic up ahead. Whoa, settle down. They're fighting for a good cause. Dear Tim and Moby, I've heard about segregation, but I don't really get it. Why couldn't black and white kids go to school together? Thanks, Maddie. Hi, Maddie. It's true. Before the 1960s, many children attended segregated schools. That means African American kids were kept away from white kids. The practice began shortly after the Civil War. The South was in ruins, and millions of ex-slaves were suddenly free. They could work and live alongside whites as equals, not servants. For many Southerners, this was intolerable. They immediately set out to disenfranchise African Americans. In other words, to block their participation in our democracy. New constitutional amendments were supposed to prevent that sort of thing. But down south, there was no one to enforce them. With the black vote squashed, racist lawmakers were free to do as they pleased. They passed laws to segregate all areas of society, not just schools. Businesses, public places, and neighborhoods were kept separate too. There were early attempts to fight these discriminatory laws. In 1892, Homer Plessy sat in a whites-only train car in New Orleans. He hoped to get arrested so segregation could be fought on legal grounds. The case was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. The court ruled that segregation didn't violate the Constitution. Plessy versus Ferguson said black and white facilities could be separate but equal. In practice, facilities were rarely equal. And that was just one part of what made life so intolerable. Segregation policed black behavior, too. Curfews kept African Americans from leaving their homes or meeting in groups. They had to live in separate neighborhoods, hold specific jobs, and talk to whites with the utmost respect. It was a new form of social control to keep African Americans in their place.
So if you guys have ever heard of this term redlining, this is something that isn't allowed really anymore. It kind of stopped in the 1970s, early 1970s. But basically, black people are only allowed to live in certain areas of certain towns, and those areas would be usually the poor areas. And obviously, if you're living in a poor area, it's a little tougher to make more wealth and income. It's tougher to get out of poverty as opposed to someone who grows up already born rich, okay, in a richer area. And this just is another way to, that kept African Americans down. But this is known as redlining. So segregation went just beyond using a water fountain or using a bathroom or going to the park. It went as far as the schools, the military, and obviously where people were living. Okay, and where people are living has a huge impact on their life at times.
Try to fight it, and you risk jail time, injury, even death. The laws and the society they created are known as Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a character used by minstrels. White comedians would paint their faces black and impersonate African Americans. Their impressions ranged from savage brutes to helpless fools. Insulting images of grinning faces were used to sell products, while scarier depictions could be called on to rile up a mob. Black men in particular were seen as dangerous figures. The 1915 silent movie Birth of a Nation popularized this myth. Screenings were often followed by riots and attacks on innocent people. Membership in terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan exploded. The KKK used fear and paranoia to spread hatred of African Americans. The slightest misstep, like looking a white person in the eye, could get you lynched. That meant being tortured and killed, often by hanging. Black Southerners were never really safe and lived in constant fear.
Okay, so that's where we are right now. Okay, lynching is something we'll talk about more over the next couple of days and months, but this is the first time being introduced to it if you haven't been already. That was a key use of fear that the KKK would use and other groups would use to try and prevent black people from kind of standing up for their rights and for their equality. Okay, so now we're going to go into the next thing here. 1 second. We do have a Supreme Court case, so you're going to hear the music now. Okay, so this case is known as Plessy versus Ferguson. So again, you're just going to copy down what's in yellow. This is, you could probably put, again, in the top 5 worst Supreme Court cases. I know we already had Dred Scott versus Sanford under that one. This is another bad one, and we'll kind of talk about why. So just copy down what's in yellow. We'll go through the facts of the case a little bit, and then we'll talk about how this led to basically segregation everywhere. Okay, so let's set up a situation. So you have this person by the name of Homer Plessy. Now, Homer Plessy is an interesting person because he's a mix between being white and black. In fact, I think he's only 1/8 black. So he's a mostly white person. Okay. But he's going to try and kind of expose the problem of segregation. He's actually going to, if you were listening to the Brain Pop, he's going to intentionally get arrested. So very similar to Rosa Parks in 1954, Homer Plessy is going to board a train and then go and sit in the white person segregated part of the train. Okay, so a whites only car basically, and obviously he's going to get the police called on him and he's going to get arrested. He does this intentionally because he wants to basically point out, like, this is a stupid practice. I'm 7/8 white. You know, I'm not allowed because I look a little black. If you look up a picture of Homer Plessy, you can see he's a very light-skinned person. He goes into that part of the train, gets arrested, and then eventually his arrest becomes a huge topic and a huge interest to a lot of people. So eventually the case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court's going to look at the new 14th Amendment, which we've spent some time on. Now remember, the 14th Amendment is supposed to protect minority groups in the country, okay? And it's supposed to make sure that laws are not passed that hurts a group of people. All right, but this Supreme Court decided that having separate but equal, that's the term in Plessy versus Ferguson, having separate facilities, having separate bathrooms, having separate water fountains, having separate beaches, having separate schools is legal. It's not illegal. You're not taking away someone's 14th Amendment rights as long as they are equal. So I always remember this Supreme Court case when I was your age for a 5-word sentence. Separate but equal is okay. That is the Supreme Court ruling. It basically rules that what the Jim Crow laws are doing and what the Jim Crow laws are saying are legal according to the Constitution, as long as they are equal. All right, now we know that they are not equal, okay, but that's what the ruling was. Okay, so as long as the schools were equal in quality, that would be perfectly fine. The 14th Amendment does not specify about groups being together. The 14th Amendment just makes sure that the law does not specifically hurt a group of people. Now, we know in practice over the next 20 to 30 to 50 years that this would hurt the African American community because when they were separate, the colored community was not being treated equally. All right, and that's just clear. All right. The other thing it's going to do is it's going to expand the Jim Crow laws to the north. So now it goes from being a city or a state decision to be segregated. Since the Supreme Court decided, now it made segregation legal throughout the entire country, not just in the South. All right, so Plessy versus Ferguson not only backs up the Jim Crow laws, it expands it to the north and expands it to the rest of the country. So any city, any town, any state could make a law that separates whites and blacks, okay, depending on whatever situation it is. I think at this point in the early 1900s, when PS 89 gets created, I'm fairly certain PS 89, I know PS 89 was a segregated school. I'm fairly certain it was a white segregated school. So back in 1940, 1950, it was a white school, not a black school, but obviously that would change later on in American history with some new things. All right. Well, I mean, it had to be one or the other. Okay, you couldn't have whites and blacks going to school together, so it was either going to be a white school or a colored school. It's going to be one or the other. That's many schools all throughout the country. Okay, if it's older than 1964 or 1954 rather. Okay, so having separate but equal facilities was the law. PSA now was made in the 1920s, I think. So I might be wrong about that. Okay, so you have the Jim Crow laws, you have Plessy versus Ferguson. You are now, how do I put this? Every single topic that we talk about in American history from like today until roughly April, maybe early May, blacks and whites are going to be segregated. So no matter what topic it is, blacks and whites will be segregated, and it is a very unfortunate situation because this leads to a lot of problems in both communities, but mostly in the black community. Okay, which is just the first start and situation of struggles in blacks after the Compromise of 1877. Things were going really well throughout Reconstruction after the Compromise of 1877. Things are starting to go bad, and this is the first thing and first reason that it starts to do that. All right. So today we focused on the Jim Crow laws. Tomorrow we're going to focus on something called sharecropping, which is going to be a big job that a lot of African Americans would have after the Compromise of 1877. We'll kind of explain why and what that was all about. Okay, right now you have about 12 minutes. You have plenty of time to work on the assignment. I think there's a good chance many of you will finish without much of a problem. I want you guys just to kind of keep in mind that tonight is the last textbook reading of 2020, so have a little bit of fun with that, or just get it done, either or. There's a reading on the Jim Crow laws. Okay, it's 2 pages, but the writing is really big, so you guys get an opportunity to work on this. It goes into a little more details, like why they were named the Jim Crow laws and some other things we didn't talk about, and you're going to answer the questions here. The first 5 questions are all from the reading. Okay, so answer the questions from the reading, and then questions 6 and 7 are analysis questions. Okay, these are analysis questions, meaning they're not from the reading, but using your prior knowledge from what we've learned this week, you could obviously answer those. So you have about 10 minutes to work on this. I will be here if you have any questions, but right now don't go anywhere because obviously I have to take all the students' attendance.